In today's note, we are going to be looking at a topic that is based off of this map. So taking a look at this map, the topic that we're going to be looking at deals with the countries that are in red. So kind of think about what do all three of these countries have in common and that is different from all the other countries in blue. And if you're not too sure, you may have seen this before somewhere on the internet. But what we're going to be looking at is measurement systems. So the three countries in red, the United States, Liberia, and Myanmar, what they use is a system called the Imperial System. And all of the other countries in blue primarily use the metric system, or mainly the metric system. Now, if you're familiar with these types of measurements, then you will probably realize that we do use parts of the imperial system in Canada, but primarily a lot of the stuff is in the metric system. So we're going to be looking at those two types of measurement systems today. And while we're primarily familiar with the metric system, because again, that's what we've kind of grown up using in Canada, it's very prevalent, we are going to look at the imperial system because being so close to the United States, a lot of our measurements that we commonly use in our everyday lives also use the imperial system, even though again that's not the main measurement or system of measurement in Canada. So the two main systems are the metric, which is again what we're used to. So the basic units of linear measure, we would have millimeter, centimeter, meter, kilometer. The imperial system uses inches, or an inch, then a foot or feet, yards, and then miles. So again, different units of measurement, but again, I'm sure you've heard of the majority of these. So the common abbreviations for imperial units are as follows. So for an inch, we have basically IN, or we sometimes have kind of two apostrophes or a quotation. So 3 inches, we might say 3 IN or 3 with the quotation mark. Foot or feet is FT, or 1 quotation mark or 1 apostrophe, you could say. So if we had 4 feet, we might say that this is 4 FT or 4 with the dash. A yard, we have YD. So 7 yards could be written as 7 YD. And a mile, we have MI is the most commonly used one. So 2 miles would be 2 MI. You may also see it as M, but primarily it's MI. Again, M might be confused with meters. So again, especially because the metric system is the main system in Canada, we would tend to use MI for miles instead of M. However, if you were in the United States or Liberia or Myanmar, you might see it as M. Looking at the 3 units, if it helps to know the conversion between them, because the nice thing about the metric system, it was always in units of 10, right? 10 millimeters equals 1 centimeter, 100 centimeters equals a meter, 1,000 meters equals a kilometer. So it's always that unit of 10. For the imperial system, it's not quite that. So what we have, so from 1 inch to a foot, we have 12 inches equals 1 foot. From a foot to a yard, we have 3 feet. So 3 feet equals 1 yard. And then from yards to a mile, we have 1,700 and 60 yards equals a mile. So again, just kind of a helpful tip, or not really a tip, just helpful to see how the units convert to each other. We're not going to be using too much of that, but again, at least maybe the inches to foot or inches to feet tends to be helpful. Frequently, the imperial measurement will combine units together. So when we're dealing with the metric system, or what you've dealt with previously, it's usually only one unit at a time. Again, because it deals with that base 10 kind of conversion. But when we're dealing with the imperial system, they tend to combine units together. So when we're dealing with, say, feet and inches, so 4 feet and 5 inches, we could write that as 4 feet. So again, we use the apostrophe, and then 5 inches, we use the quotation mark or the 2 apostrophes. So generally speaking, if you're dealing with height, you tend to see this a lot. We might see inches alone. So we have, say again, just similar to above, 15 inches. Or you could say just 15 IN. If we're dealing with fractions, so we have 8 1/4 inches. So again, just using fractions. Or again, you could say 8 1/4 inches. And when we're dealing with decimals, we would take that fraction and turn it into a decimal. So we have our 5, and then 3/4 is the same as 0.75. So you'd say 5.75 inches or 5.75 IN, again, depending on which unit or abbreviation you want to use. So we're just going to look at completing the table. So we want to convert or look at the different measurements as fractions and as decimals. So we see the measurement as a fraction. We have 3 3/8 inch, or 3 3/8 inches. So we know that the first part is going to be 3, and now we just need to figure out what is the decimal going to be. So in this case, our decimal is going to be the 3 divided by the 8. So to convert a fraction to a decimal, we just divide. So for example, 3 divided by 8 equals 0.375. So as a decimal, this would be 3.375 inches. If we're going the other way, we know we're going to have 2 as our whole number. Now we need to convert the decimal, the 0.75, to a fraction. So the easiest way to do it, if we have 2 decimal places, or we look at 2 decimal places and we put it out of 100. So in this case, we have 75 over 100. That's 0.75. We could also then try to reduce this to lowest terms. Or basically, if I have 75 out of 100, I can reduce both by 25 or divide both by 25, and I get 3/4. So it's just an equivalent fraction. So I would say I have 2 3/4 of an inch. The next one, 1 and then 15/16 of an inch. So again, 1 is going to be my whole number. To figure out the decimal part, I just need to do 15 divided by 16 to turn that into a decimal. 15 divided by 16 is 0.9375. So my entire measurement as a decimal will be 1.9375 inches. For 7.5, so 7.5 inches, again, my whole number is going to be 7. Now I need to convert 0.5 to a fraction. So 0.5 or 0.50 would be the same as saying 50 over 100, or it's basically a half. So that means as a fraction, I would have 7 1/2 of an inch. So that would be kind of converting as a fraction and as a decimal. Again, depending on how you want to explain or describe your measurement. The second thing is looking at rulers or reading a ruler, looking at the imperial system. So again, most measuring tapes or rulers have both the metric system and the imperial system on it. Again, hopefully you're comfortable with the metric system, but there are cases where you will need to use the imperial system. A lot of construction, a lot of measuring, look at dimensions of anything in construction or building things or putting things together, tends to be in metric as well as the imperial system. And you tend to sometimes see the imperial system first and then the metric system. So in the metric system, centimeters are divided into 10 equal parts. So again, that's why it's nice and easy to read or to explain or describe things in using the metric system. In the imperial system, what they do is they divide the inches in half, and then each half is divided in half again, and so on. And then the smallest fraction we'll be working with in this case is 1/16. But if we just want kind of like a little tip or a little kind of cheat sheet, so basically if we have 1, then we have 1/2, and then a half of a half is a quarter, then an eighth, then a 16th. So those are kind of like a little cheat sheet of how it will be broken down in terms of the fractions. So if we kind of look at an example, how many spaces are there in each segment of the rulers below? So if we look at the first one, there are 2 segments, right? So we see, if I just kind of highlight it here, we see one here and another segment here. So there are 2 segments. So so that means that this section here is 1/2. So we have 0, a half, and then 1. If we look at the next one, it's broken up into 4 segments. So that means, again, half is halfway in between, then half of a half is a quarter. So this would be 1/4. So 1/4, a half, or 2 quarters. Then we have 3 quarters, and then 1. So we're kind of making our cheat sheet on the side here already. Looking at the next one, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we have 8 different segments. Again, half, and then half of a half we found out was a quarter. So then half of a quarter is an eighth. So 1/8, 1/4, or 2/8. Then we have 3/8, half or 4/8, then 5/8, 6/8 or 3/4, and then 7/8, and then 1. And looking at the last one, again, we know kind of our cheat sheet. So again, we're dividing those halves again. So we have 16 segments. Again, we have a half, a quarter, we have an eighth, and then we have 1/16. So I'm just going to kind of leave it at that just because it might get messy trying to put them all in there, but just showing you how it's broken down into the different parts. Number 2, what is the difference in the length of dividing lines in relation to the number of spaces in each inch segment. So in regards to the length of the dividing lines to the number of spaces, again, there may be no right or wrong answer to this, and I'll be honest, I had some trouble thinking about this one myself, but best thing I could say is the larger the line, the fewer the spaces in each segment, right? So if we look at half, right, the line that represents a half is the largest dividing line, which corresponds to the least number of spaces. So the larger the line, the fewer spaces. That's probably the best kind of description between the length of the dividing lines and the number of spaces between each inch segment. So what we're going to do here is now we're going to look at practicing writing down some different measurements, or basically reading different measurements from our kind of makeshift rulers here. So here we want to, again, for each arrow, we're going to write down the measurement, and we're going to assume it's an imperial ruler. So the 1 represents 1 inch, 1 inch, and so on. So again, here we have our half. This is half of a half. So this would be 1/4 of an inch. If we look here, this is our third space, or our third line. So that would be 3/4, because again, we can see that it's already broken up into halves, or half of a half. Again, going forward, so now we've gone past 1 and we're at half. So we have 1 and 1/2 of an inch. And again, there's different ways you could write it. You could write it like this, or if we've seen before, you could use the decimals, 1.5 inches. Here we have 2 inches, 2.5 inches. We're at 3, so we're at 3.25 inches, or 3.25 inches. Again, just the two different formats. And then finally, the third one, 3/4, so 3 3/4 of an inch, or 3.75 inches. Again, different ways that you can write it, whether you want to use fractions or decimals. For B, I'm going to go through. So again, we can see that we're dividing our lines up even further. So here we can see it. We have our inch, we have our half. The next smaller line is a half of a half, so this is 1/4. And then we're down to half of 1/4, which is 1/8. So I'm going to leave it as fractions here. So 1/8 of an inch. If we make our way here, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5/8 of an inch. The nice thing is, when we know the smallest unit or the smallest fraction, we can just count the lines and use that as our fractions. So again, we've gone past 1 and our line here, so we know we're starting at 1, and we can count the lines. So 1, 2, we know the smallest unit is 2 inches, or sorry, eighths, so we can say 1 2/8 of an inch. Or, because we're familiar with reducing fractions, 2/8 is the same thing as saying 1 1/4. So we could say 1 1/4 of an inch. The next one, again, counting. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we have 1 6/8 of an inch. Or again, we can reduce it to 1 3/4. We have our 2 inches again. And again, now we've gone past 2, so we can count 1, 2, 3. So this is 2 3/8 of an inch. We can't really reduce this one any further, so we'll just leave it as that fraction. Again, that's our next line. If that's 3, then we have 1, or 4, 5, 6, 7. So 2 and 7/8 of an inch. This fraction cannot be reduced, so we'll leave it at that. Now we've hit 3. Again, we can see our different lines, so we could again count, so 1, 2, and have it as 2/8, or again recognizing that that is our third or second smallest line. So we have 3 and 1/4 of an inch. And the next one is 3 and 1/2 of an inch. So again, as you become more familiar with that, you can kind of see the fractions already without having to add up the smallest fraction and then reduce it. But again, if you need to go that step, so if you needed to write 3 and 2/8 of an inch or 3 and 4/8 of an inch, you can do that as well and then recognize, oh, well, 4/8 is the same thing as a half. Moving on to C. So now what we're going to do is, again, we've broken it down one step further. So we've added in now the smallest fraction, which is a 1/16. So the smallest line is a 1/16. So we go from 1 to a half to a quarter to an eighth to a 1/16. So again, by recognizing that, we can kind of use shortcuts. So we know that these big lines, or these lines here, represents an eighth. So this is the same as saying 1/8 of an inch. Again, by going through and breaking it down, you could say that that's 2/16 of an inch. Again, recognizing that 2/16 can be broken down into 1/8. So here we go here. So this is now 1/8, 2/8, 3/8 is going to be the quick one. So 3/8 of an inch. Or again, you could say, well, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6/16 of an inch. Again, counting up the smallest one. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Here we have 9/16 of an inch. So here you might have to actually count because there's no way to kind of shorten that. The nice thing, as soon as we get past a whole number, we kind of restart our counting. So here we know it's going to be 1. And then we have only one small dash, so that's going to be 1 and 1/16 of an inch. Going further, again, counting our lines. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1 and 7/16 of an inch. We can't reduce that any further, so we'll leave it at that. We can see here, again, past 1. So 1, again, looking at our lines, we can see that that is the second smallest one. So we have our half, so that would be a quarter. And we have 1, 2, 3 quarters. Again, if you really needed to, you could count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And represent it as 1 and 12/16 of an inch. So again, just recognizing that the smallest ones represent a 1/16, add them all up, and then realize, oh, I can reduce that further. At 2, and we have 2 1/4 of an inch. Then we have the next one, 2. So again, here we have a half, or basically 8/16, 7/16. Or sorry, not 7, 9. Went backwards. So 9/16 of an inch. Here we're still at 2. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So 2, 14/16 of an inch. Oops. And again, you could reduce that to or 2 and it would be 7/8 of an inch. Again, they mean the same thing, they're just equivalent fractions. 3 and 3/8 of an inch. 3 1/2 of an inch, and 3 3/4 of an inch. And again, you could write it out in ways where you're using 16ths, but hopefully you start to recognize what the different lines represent when we have all of them there. So the next one, this one I want you to try to do on your own. So take some time, if you're working on this at home, pause the video for a second to try to fill this out on your own, and we'll come back with the answers. So coming back to our solutions, this is what your measurements or your readout should look like. Again, if you've decided to do this in decimals, you can just divide each fraction just to confirm that it does work out to the same. But we've gone through and done it as fractions, so again, ideally this is what you would like it to look like. And again, if you did it as decimals, there's nothing wrong with that. Again, your answers might look slightly different though, so just keep that in mind. And again, so that is basically it for looking at the imperial measurement system. Again, hopefully you're familiar with the terms, but at least now you're a little bit more familiar with going through and reading the rulers in the imperial system. And again, you may be familiar with this already, so this might just be a quick refresher. And then, yeah, again, just making sure you understand how to read the different measurements and fractions in terms of inches.